And why not? Are you really going to cover for this kid? If an outside family tried to work on their own in the pleasure district, they would be considered spies. Do you really want to attract the attention of the Ishtar family? Kanu and his lackeys openly winced at the dwarf's point. Lily remembered him. The dwarf named Chandra had recently joined the family, and being a level 2, he was making quite a name for himself. She summoned her last bit of strength to look up, imagining the face of this dwarf who somehow wasn't trying to harm or oppress her. As usual, Xanis alone looked down at the battered Lily. Humph. Well, he began, narrowing his eyes as if considering Kanu's objection. Lily stared vacantly into those eyes of his, as they glittered behind his glasses with the poise of someone who wanted to be seen as a man of reason. Eventually, his mouth curved into an unpleasant crescent. Chandra's right. There's no need to arouse useless suspicion. Let's just let her to keep working for the family as usual. Heh. It'll be more fun, too. Xanis laughed, as if Lily's cold and utterly resentful gaze was amusing to him. Lily was silent throughout the conversation. She clenched her hands into fists. The pain and anger she felt was setting a dark fire inside her. This was not the only incident. Everything she had been through had fueled her vengeful heart. As she looked at the hateful adventurer looking at her with that smile, Lily distinctly felt the whispers of her grudge begin to overflow. As the days and months passed, Lily approached the age of 13. She began to fulfill her desire for revenge. In the pouring rain, a wild and angry scream echoed through the alley. The confused footsteps and cries of despair of several adventurers were clearly audible to the beautiful young elf over her own ragged breathing. Her feet splashed through puddles as she ran, and when she finally escaped her pursuers, she stopped and leaned against a wall. As her hair as the golden rain soaked her, she forced herself to control her breathing, then spoke softly. The midnight bell strikes. The instant she muttered the chant, her body was enveloped in a veil of gray light. The next moment, the form of the elf girl who had been there moments before had disappeared, replaced by Lily, her brown hair plastered to her cheek. With a shivering breath and body, she opened the package she was carrying. Inside were adventurer accessories, rings and bracelets that gleamed in gold and silver, as well as rare monster drops and even a magic knife. Lily's eyes filled with tears, and a smile appeared on her lips. I did it. I did it. Serves you right. This was the fruit of her magic, Cinderella. The spell had appeared during a status update half a year ago, and she had used it to escape from the adventurers. She disguised herself as a harmless and charming elf supporter and approached some adventurers, and then, while escorting them to the dungeon, made off with their valuables. Lily raised her voice in genuine laughter for the first time in years. She was filled with dark pleasure. She could still hear the screams of the adventurers she had robbed. She did her best to control her urge to gloat, but the urge to laugh was too strong. Now that she had dispelled the magic, she was no longer the elven thief they were looking for, and was therefore beyond their reach. All she needed to do now was transform back and sell her loot to earn some serious, untraceable cash. Lily looked up at the sky in triumph. Every adventurer who has ever made me suffer will get what they deserve. No doubt there were other ways Cinderella could have helped her earn money. She certainly could have found a different way to earn a living. But after enduring so much suffering, Lily's bitter resentment would not allow it. These reserves of anger and pain forced the little girl to swear revenge on the adventurers. In her old life, she had stayed alive by drinking muddy water, but today would be a complete break from that. She would take back everything the adventurers had stolen from her and earn her freedom with her own hands. Guilt threatened to rise up inside her, but she pushed it away, sealing it deep within her heart. Lily forced herself to keep smiling. After a few more moments of fun, it was time to leave. The rain was little different from the rain on the day she had been chased away by the only people who had openly shown her any kindness. As it drenched her, Lily dragged her bleeding and beaten body into the foggy city and disappeared. After that day, Lily played the thief game constantly. She would set traps for the adventurers in the dungeon, steal anything valuable they had, and then beat a hasty retreat out of the labyrinth. Occasionally, the adventurers, enraged at being betrayed by a mere supporter, would escape the trap and chase her, but her transformation magic was flawless and no one could catch her. The few times she stole valuables from members of her own family helped to sate her grudge a little. She did her best to ignore the emptiness she felt beneath her dark pleasure. In fact, she used the strength of her rekindled anger to fight back these pathetic feelings, wondering if she had forgotten everything that had been done to her. As she continued to exact revenge on the adventurers, 2 years quickly passed. Lily looked into a barrel filled with water and realized that it was her own eyes that were stagnant. She was in a cheap inn that she was using as a hideout. That day, she again lured some adventurers into a trap, spilled crimson blood, left monster corpses, and she was so covered in ash that she had to laugh. As she stared at the barrel, a children's story suddenly came to her mind. Perhaps it was the old couple from the flower shop who had read it to her. She couldn't remember exactly where she had seen it, but it was a very common story. The story was about a ragged girl who was always covered in ash and ashes. Thanks to a spell cast by a mischievous fairy, she turned into a girl of extraordinary beauty. Taking the chance to enjoy this brief dream, the girl went to the palace, where the prince fell in love with her at first sight. When the spell began to break, she fled the palace, but the prince looked for her the next day. He came to get her, and although the spell had been broken, they still lived happily ever after. Lily looked at her bloodied, ash-covered face in the water barrel and found herself plagued by doubt. When did the deception of the transformation magic wear off? Would anyone who would reach out to her true self exist? This is ridiculous. Lily scoffed at her thoughts and her reflection in the mirror. Alone in her room, she wrapped herself in the dusty sheets of the bed as she erased her desolate feelings with her hatred for adventurers. Her cold hands had forgotten what the warmth of another person felt like. Outside the window, the moonlit sky above watched. There was no such thing. There was no prince who would come to save her. Those were only for children's fairy tales. Indeed, there was no such thing as a hero. No one was coming for her. And that was why today too she would put on her mask, pretend to be an innocent little girl, and deceive another foolish adventurer. Her next prey was an easy choice, obviously a human rookie who had actually tried to defend her from another enraged adventurer. Just as she was wondering what this boy could possibly be thinking when he came to the aid of a dirty-looking girl he had never seen before, he said something ridiculous like, "I couldn't ignore a girl in trouble," or something. It was so stupid, so absurd, so utterly unheard of, that all Lily could do was laugh. He had hair as white as his words were innocent, and his rubelite eyes were like a rabbit's. The unmistakable traces of the country were still about him. He had to be a newcomer to the city. She could smell him, that bottomless, good-natured naivety. The environment he had lived in had blessed him, unlike a certain miserable plum. He had obviously never experienced any real suffering. So Lily would educate him. She would teach him about the filth of this city, its harshness, its cruel indifference. She would teach him that without divine favor, reality would mercilessly grind him to dust. The price for that lesson would be the knife. Black he carried that didn't suit him. She would soil his immaculate heart like hers had been and cloud his eyes until they resembled hers. She would stain him as she had been stained. Betrayed, he would scream and no one would believe him. And he would never say anything as inane as, "I couldn't ignore a girl in trouble," to anyone again. He was such an obvious country bumpkin, it wouldn't take long. Besides, if she could get her hands on that masterpiece knife of his, she might finally have enough money. She might finally be able to free herself from her family. Now, to smear herself with ashes and start the scam. So once again, Lily called for an adventurer, believing that her only hope was to continue deceiving herself and those around her. "Hey! You there! You with the white hair!